All right. Good evening, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. So by some requests and also just to make things easier for busy people, which I understand being one, I'm going to record all of these and then I'll put them on my YouTube channel as well and send out links and the like. So we're going to do this as a series of 5 sessions over the next 5 months. So I'll do a presentation in August today, September, October, November, and December. It roughly corresponds to the structure of Pope Leo's encyclical. So the encyclical has 5 major chapters, and each evening we'll be roughly going over one of the chapters. Except tonight. I was thinking about this and praying about this, and I realized that to start things off before kind of the deeper dive into Catholic social teaching and the like, I wanted to spend some time going over AI in general. And so I've got an attempt at making it accessible. We'll see how it goes. So, whoops, there we go. So, a little about me. I'm a catechist for the Diocese of Little Rock. Here at St. Joseph, I've been teaching in the OCIA, RCIA program since 2002. My day job is I'm a professor of computer science at Hendrix, and relevant to that, I've been active in the AI research community since 1994, so over 30 years now. Over that time, I've published 14 research papers on various topics within AI, and I continue to do scholarly work in robotics that uses AI in various ways. I am originally from South Florida. This will be relevant at one point later in the talk. I'm just kind of planting the seed now. My dad is from Havana, Cuba. My mom is from Puerto Rico. So what's my overall presentation plan? Tonight, I'm going to give an overview of what artificial intelligence involves, go quite a bit beyond what you're seeing in popular press and the like. And I will cover a few of the ideas from the introduction and from chapter 1. Then in September, my plan is to go over Catholic social teaching in depth. It is a topic that is not nearly as widely understood as it should be, and there are aspects of our American political culture that often make it hard to follow and relate to. And so we're going to take a really careful walk through it in September. We're going to be sampling it a bit tonight as well. Then in October, we're going to go over the chapter Technology and Dominance, which really does start getting into the interaction between the technical and the theological. Then in November, the chapter Safeguarding Humanity. And then we'll conclude in December with Culture of Power and Civilization of Love. So a bit about my presentation style. I am accustomed to classes where students just ask questions whenever. So you don't have to wait till the end. Feel free to raise your hand if it feels polite, but also feel free to just interject if you feel like it. So, and I'm not really planning for the presentations to last the full scheduled time. And much of the reason for this is that I want to leave open some space for discussion and just doing any kind of deep dive into this material that is of interest to any of you who are here tonight. So, all of that said, what is artificial intelligence? Given the way it's talked about in the popular press, I think it's going to be surprising to many of you how deep the history of the field is time-wise. So here's a fun question just to kick things off. I often use this question when I'm teaching my introductory programming classes. Does anybody know off the tops of your heads when the first electronic digital computer came online?
As in the.
came into, somebody hit the power button and any wild guesses? 50s is close. 50s is close. It's 1945. That's pretty relevant, Ron, actually, because the reason the first electronic computers were developed was to make it faster to calculate ballistics tables. So what does that mean in military terms? If you are firing a piece of artillery on the battlefield, you need to figure out, given the distance to the target, what angle do you need to position the artillery piece so that when it follows a parabolic path, it hits the target that you're going for. So every time you've got a new piece of artillery introduced to the battlefield, you have to calculate tables of, for every possible angle of inclination, what is the distance that the artillery shell will travel? These are very expensive to calculate, and they would have roomfuls of people that would hand calculate these things. So during World War II, there was a lot of interest in computing for a number of reasons, and we're going to talk about some of those as we proceed. But the military very much wanted to accelerate this process. And that resulted in a lot of funding for developing electronic computers that could really make this fast. So a lot of what's interesting about this is if the first computers came online in 1945, it was a very short period of time to when people started thinking about, okay, how can we simulate what minds do with a computer? So in 1950, there was a paper published by the computing pioneer Alan Turing, who was a mathematician and employed by the British military during World War II. He's particularly famous for breaking the German Enigma codes during the war. What he's known for in the computing world is twofold. First, in his 1936 PhD thesis, he wrote about what a theoretical computing machine would be able to do in principle. And this gets super math nerdy, so you'll just have to forgive me for a moment when I go off on a tangent. Anybody remember, like, when you were in high school or whatever, doing proofs in like geometry class or whatever? Sound kind of familiar? I know, some of you banished the memory. So there was a lot of work done in the early 20th century looking at the question of, are there true statements that you can't prove? Are there truths that are unprovable in a mathematical formalism? And so there was some mathematical results from the 1930s by the mathematician Kurt Gödel. This is known as Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And what he showed is that if you've got a system of mathematics sufficiently powerful to represent integers, so that you can add one to something over and over again, then within that system, there will exist true statements that no proof exists for. And so what Turing did in his 1936 thesis was, building on that idea, imagined a computing device that would try to automatically generate these proofs. And in so doing, he wound up actually proving some important properties about what a computer can and cannot do. And one of the examples of, kind of the most famous example that he proved what a computer cannot do is known as the halting problem. So the halting problem states that if I write a computer program, it takes another computer program as input, that first program can't be guaranteed to terminate, to halt, if it's trying to figure out if the other one ever halts on some particular input. And this actually winds up being of immense practical value because, for instance, it means that if I'm writing an operating system is one of the classes I teach, by the way, at Hendrix. I can't write it to figure out if any other program I run will ever stop. So that's actually of tremendous practical importance. So Turing proved that in the general case, there's no way for a computer to figure that out, which was an extremely important result. He's also well known for this 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And here he introduced what he called the imitation game. So what's the idea of the imitation game? You have three participants in the game, a human judge, a human participant, and a computer participant. And he asks the reader to imagine that the human judge is sitting at a computer terminal, and the human participant is sitting in a different room on another terminal, and then the computer is, in some big room somewhere. Then they're typing out chat messages to each other, and both the computer and human are trying to convince the judge that they are the human. And if the judge cannot distinguish them, we would say that the computer wins the imitation game. Now, this idea of the imitation game has become known as the Turing test. The idea being that if you've got a computer that when a human interacts with that program, the human can't really determine that it's a computer, we would say that that program passes the Turing test. And that's something that's going to come up a lot later on in this presentation as we think about this material. Now, Turing went on in this paper to make some philosophical arguments, and that's actually going to be a really interesting part of some things we're going to have to talk about this evening. Is we're going to do some pretty active philosophical work, because a lot of what we're encountering really gets fairly deep into philosophy, and there's a lot to talk about there that's quite important. So he made the philosophical argument that if the computer wins the imitation game, passes the Turing test, that the question of whether it's conscious or has a soul or whatever is not an interesting question. Now, obviously, as a Catholic Christian, I would disagree with his assertion. But that assertion became incredibly influential in the computing world, in the computing community. And people adopting that point of view is a lot of what we really have to deal with now in a big way. So in 1956, taking some inspiration from this, there was a workshop held at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. And there were a few dozen participants, many of whom went on to become extremely important pioneers in the field of artificial intelligence and in computer science in general. And this is a quotation from the proposal for the workshop about what they were setting out to do. The study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can, in principle, be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. An attempt will be made to find how to make machines use language, form abstractions and concepts, solve kinds of problems now reserved for humans, and improve themselves. And it was at the 1956 workshop that the term artificial intelligence was first introduced. So it's actually a 70-year-old term. So this is a lot of what I'm doing tonight is I'm giving you all a lot of context that probably most of the population doesn't know if they haven't actually formally studied the topic. So I'm giving you kind of like an overview of what I take about a semester to do, typically when I teach the course. So what were the research agendas like after the Dartmouth workshop? There were 4 areas of study that people focused on. One area of study that garnered interest immediately was strategy games. So there was the sense of thinking about games like chess as exemplars of intelligence. So if I can make a computer that plays chess really well, then maybe I'll achieve artificial intelligence, was the idea. Logical reasoning is another. We're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about that. Natural language processing. So when I use that phrase, natural language processing, it's worth taking a moment to talk about what a computer really is and what it does. So at the deepest level, a computer is just a circuit. You hook it up to a power source, electricity is flowing through it. Now, it's obviously a very sophisticated circuit, but at its heart, it really doesn't do a whole lot. A CPU in a computer is really only capable of the following things. It can do basic arithmetic, so like adding, and with a really clever trick, you can subtract. Things like multiplication are like built on top of this. It can store a sequence of instructions in memory and have something pointing at saying this is the current instruction. Then it can check a condition in memory and decide which instruction to go to next, depending on that. And it can read and write to memory. And really nothing else. Now, you might think, that's absurd. I carry a computer in my pocket. I can talk to my kids on it. What have you, right? I can watch movies. And what I'm telling you is that all of those activities boil down to selecting the next instruction to execute, reading memory, writing memory, and doing arithmetic. That's it. And if anybody wants to do a deep dive on any of these things, I can walk you through exactly how something like watching a movie just boils down to that. That's it. Now, these instructions really just represent which logic gates in silicon are active and which ones are not active. So it's a bunch of ones and zeros, going with stereotypes about computers. Saying this is going, this is not going, or whatever. So the point of these instructions is that they are fully formal, right? No human being talks like that. Not even someone like me. I've been programming since 1981. I think, yeah, about 1981. And so the idea of natural language processing is to say, well, thinking in the way a computer thinks is really hard. And it is. So if we can find a way to get a computer to understand natural language, that would make life easier. And then finally, neural networks. So we're going to talk about those quite a bit as well. With strategy games, the leading pioneer was a guy named Arthur Samuel, who worked at IBM from 1949 to 1966. And he was really intrigued by a lot of these ideas and concepts and developed the first AI for checkers. And because this wasn't the kind of work that paid any bills for IBM, what he typically did was work on these projects between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., which inaugurated kind of a tradition among computer scientists. But he did a lot of extremely clever stuff that's still present in strategy game AIs to this day. And among other things, he even came up with a really clever scheme for it to improve through playing games against itself. And so the basis of the idea is, it'll play through a game and then try to assign numerical credit for the degree to which each move it made contributed to a win or a loss. And you can basically build a big complicated formula for that. And it's pretty effective. It's a pretty interesting technique. So this really laid the foundation for later cutting edge game AIs that we have today. But it was certainly by no means a general purpose AI. And what I mean by emphasizing that is these programs were written with the specifics of the game rules built directly into the program. So it was a reasoning engine that couldn't handle things that are not checkers. And not only things that are not checkers, but checkers according to an extremely specific set of rules. So if you're a checkers aficionado, you might encounter people that play with slightly different rules. For instance, like the basic rules of checkers are that if it's possible to capture a piece, you're actually compelled to do so. But not everybody plays that. And so when you program a game AI like that, you kind of program in, well, this is the rule set I'm going with. You must capture. And now if you try to get it to play without that rule, like you got to rewrite huge chunks of it, for instance. So what about logical reasoning? So this was an important early focus and it remains influential in the field. So the idea was to encode facts as symbols as well as inference rules. So what do I mean by this? So this is actually an example I use with my students. Let's say you've got a fact like Spider-Man and Iron Man are allies. And then you've got another fact. Iron Man and Captain America are allies. Obviously before the Civil War movie, but anyway. You can then have an inference rule where you say, if there are two people that have a common ally, it follows from that they are also allies. And so you can imagine then building an automated system that's got a database of known facts. And in practice, these things are going to have thousands or tens of thousands of these. And then inference rules that look for patterns among the facts. And so when you have an inference rule that matches some of the facts in the database, it then adds new facts as it goes, as like a conclusion from that inference rule. And so the idea here was to come up with a way of modeling in a computer the idea of this causes that, as a way of coming up with a general scheme for encoding knowledge. Now, these systems are really interesting. I'm actually personally quite fond of them. I've done a fair amount of work with this kind of a system. But they have some limits, right? Like, there are all kinds of practical day-to-day knowledge that isn't readily representable with a bunch of logical inference rules. And so that's a limitation. But what's really powerful about this idea is that you also have a system that can tell you exactly why it concluded what it concluded. So it's a system that you can audit. You know why it made a particular decision. Oh, and yeah, I guess I was anticipating this particular slide. So the strengths, we've got this flexible concept for expressing things that are logically dependent, and we've got this audit trail for inferences and decisions. Now, actually encoding a bunch of facts and inferences is really labor intensive. Like, it takes a lot of work to say, oh, I've got an encyclopedia here. How do I digest this into a bunch of facts and inferences? That's a lot of highly skilled work because you've got to be not just transcribing things, but performing abstraction and inference steps to actually encode it. And it also can't go beyond what's encoded. It doesn't have a way, if we look at this previous example, of getting beyond. If this is the only inference rule I have, the system cannot reason about anything that isn't about an alliance, for instance. So, natural language processing. Some of the early work done here came from the 1960s. And one of the best known examples of this is a program called ELIZA. And ELIZA purported to be a computational psychotherapist. But the creator of ELIZA actually didn't intend it to be a serious program. He intended it to be a case study in why this stuff was a bad idea. So I'm going to give you an example in a moment, but something that happened with this was that it inadvertently passed the Turing test at times because its pattern matching could be pretty persuasive if somebody was primed to believe it. So here's an example session that I did recently with a version of this program. So Eliza's prompts are in capital letters, and my responses are in mixed case. So begins, how do you do? Please tell me your problem. And I reply, I do not like ice cream. It then says, you say you do not like ice cream. This isn't actually true, by the way, but just a motivating example, right? So something I want to highlight here, right? I've got this statement, I do not like ice cream. The system then does pattern matching to see I am not liking, and it then just echoes back what I said. Kind of like a not deeply skilled therapist, right? You see, I do not like ice cream. I really don't. It's cold and harsh. Can you elaborate on that? So the program's got a bunch of clauses where it'll randomly throw out some kind of statement to get you to keep talking, but without any real reasoning about what's happening. So can you elaborate on it? It makes my teeth uncomfortable. Your teeth uncomfortable. So again, we're just seeing a simple pattern match. But at the same time, you're beginning to see how somebody could really get sucked into this thing. Yeah. Yes, my teeth uncomfortable. You seem quite positive. Now we begin to see the pattern matching breaking down pretty fast, right? It saw the word yes and then said, oh, you're positive. That's a positive thing to say, right? I actually feel very negative. Do you say you actually feel very negative? Again, taking the phrase, echoing it back with some context for some special reason. Yes, ice cream hurts my teeth. You are sure? I am sure. Is it because you are sure that you came to me? And at this point, it's just getting silly, right? But this fooled a lot of people. And even in 1967, people were actively saying, oh, this is like a really good therapist. Yeah, so hang on to that thought. So what about neural networks? Neural networks are a data structure intended to simulate aspects of the brain at the level of neurons. And something that I like to point out early on that continues to stun people is that the way these are engineered is based on 1950s era models of the brain, which in neuroscientific terms are completely out of date. But we still use them anyway. And let's talk a little bit about why. A neural network models the brain as a big grid of numbers, or if it doesn't bring back too many painful memories, a matrix. A matrix, like you might have seen in algebra, okay? It's really just a big matrix. And the idea of this matrix is that if you look at an entry for a particular row and column, it corresponds to what we poetically call a neuron. And I say poetically call it because it's not really a neuron. It's a matrix with a bunch of numbers. And it thinks by doing matrix multiplications. And we're going to be talking about that a lot. Now, what is really interesting about these is that you can start with kind of a blank matrix, run a bunch of data through it, and slowly adjust the numbers in the matrix so that when you perform a matrix multiplication to make a prediction, it starts corresponding to the causal relationships given in the labeled data. So an example of this would be, let's say I want to create a neural network to do handwriting recognition. So what does that mean? What's that going to look like? Well, I'm going to take images of handwritten letters. I'm going to digitize them, which is like just taking a picture with a digital camera, right? Just turns it into a big grid. Every digital picture is just a matrix, actually. So you take it, you then have a label associated with it. So I scribble something, and then I label that data as a letter A. I scribble something else, I label that as a letter B, and so forth. And then the matrix has different rows where if the biggest number in the output is this row, then we're going to declare it's an A, or declare it's a B or whatever. So we set all of this up, and by doing a lot of calculating that is very, very time consuming and expensive, you can build a model that when you show it a handwriting sample it hasn't seen before, often does a pretty good job of classifying that letter, for instance. Now, it's not just for handwriting. That was an early application that was very valuable in practice. The post office is really fond of this for reasons you might imagine, identifying addresses automatically, that kind of a thing. And a lot of what makes this really compelling is, unlike a logical reasoning system, it can guess answers, even if the inputs aren't terribly close to what was in the training set. Of course, if it's not terribly close to what's in the training set, the guesses aren't always very good. And we're going to be talking more about that as well. Now, all of that said, what again makes these pretty compelling is that this idea of using a matrix enables us to approximate any inference function you want by just with a sufficiently big grid of numbers and an appropriately labeled data set. You can kind of get it to converge on really any representable function. And that is something that is pretty compelling in practice. But they've got a lot of limitations. Creating them is difficult, error-prone, expensive, and requires a tremendous amount of data. In fact, I'm going to go so far as to say that the science of creating these is not very good. That is, these are often created in an ad hoc way where people try different sizes of matrix and different parameter tweaks at various times, and then they do the trainer and cross their fingers and maybe something good comes out. So what actually happens really frequently with neural networks is some lucky duck stumbles on one that's really good at, say, handwriting recognition or finding cats in pictures. And then they post it online and people download it and use it in their own programs because they're so difficult to get right. Inference, again, is also an expensive process. And once we start talking about language models, expensive is going to hit whole new levels of absurd. But what's also really annoying about these is it's difficult to explain how they work. That is, you've got this big matrix with a bunch of numbers in it. And then when it spits out an answer, it's really hard to figure out why it gave that particular answer. And this is bad for two reasons. One reason it's bad is that anytime we build a computing system, we're automating something, and really computer science at its best says, I've automated this and I can tell you what it's doing and why it's doing it. Very hard with neural networks. The other problem that emerges with this is that people get like totally delusional in not a good way, right? Like you've got a lack of an explanation of why exactly it's working, and then people will be all like, oh wow, it's like deep and profound and has this deep understanding of things or whatever. And that kind of loopiness is also going to be a big topic that we're going to be getting at tonight. But the lack of an audit trail is really a very serious problem. One way that this comes up is people have tried to use these to do stuff like, for a mortgage company, decide whether to accept or reject an applicant for a mortgage. So it turns out this is like really dicey legally, because if you don't have an audit trail, it may turn out that the system systematically discriminates against an underrepresented minority group or something like that. And yeah, the amount of bad that can occur here is really hard to imagine. So this brings us to large language models, which is the form of AI that's taken over the world in the last 4 years. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So, so the issue is like you get, so let's say I train it by giving it 10 examples of me drawing the letter A. Now you draw a letter A and put it in the system, and let's say it says, yes, that's a letter A. It can't readily tell you why it's an A, right? It's not going to be able to tell you, oh, this is an A because there's a stroke at this angle in this direction and not in that one. That's the issue. And so when we think about stuff like the mortgage application, it's really hard to pick out, oh, was it not enough income? Was it the race? Was it the career? That stuff's really hard to pick out. That's what I mean by saying it doesn't have an audit trail. This is a great question. Any other questions before I keep blasting forward? No, that's all good. It's all good. So what about large language models? So these are built using a type of neural network called a transformer. The transformer was developed in 2017. This is a relatively recent innovation. And I'm certainly hand waving a bit here, but this is giving you the general idea. In a transformer, it is a model of the relationship between every possible word in a sequence, in every possible place it could be in the sequence, and every other word in every other possible place in the sequence. So let me see if I can make this a little more concrete. Something that follows from this, by the way, is that there is an absolute fixed limit on the amount of text a language model can process. And that is known as the context window. So for instance, I'm going to build a language model that is the context window of 1,000 words. So if I have 1,001st word, I have overflowed the context window and it can't actually process that anymore. So imagine I've got a 1,000 word context window. And now let's imagine I've got a vocabulary of 50,000 words. So what I'm doing is modeling in each of those 1,000 positions, each of 50,000 words. And for that specific word position combination, I then have models of, if I've got this word in this position, how likely is it that I want to have this other word in this other position over here? If you think this sounds insane and mind-blowing and taking a huge amount of memory, you're right. So it then uses a neural network to work out how likely it is for word over here to have word over there following it. Yes. Yeah.
Do it for Chinese.
So for Chinese, you would probably break it down not at the word level, but at the syllable level.
So does each nation that has its own language or something that's working on AI, are they building these within their language? Not to mention, your language forms the way that you think. So does that also impact the way that these?
Massively. Yeah. So if we go back to thinking about Chinese, so in Chinese, every character corresponds to a syllable with a particular meaning. And then to put together bigger concepts, you have to put things together. Like, I'm pretty sure that computer in Chinese is something like electric brain, for example. So they put those characters together, for instance. And so, yeah, so in Chinese, so if one were building a language model for Chinese, you would have every possible character in every possible position in the input. Yeah, and that's a lot. even more interesting, the reason these were actually developed originally wasn't as chatbots, it was actually for language translation. So the idea was, if I've got, so let's talk for a minute about why it's hard for a computer to do language translation. The answer is every language has not only a distinct vocabulary, but a distinct grammar, right? So, for instance, in Spanish, to think of a language that's considered relatively easy for English speakers, relatively, adjectives typically go after the noun, except when they go before it for certain stylistic reasons, right? Whereas in English, the adjective always goes before the noun, right? So you can't just do a word-for-word translation from Spanish into English because the result just looks like nonsense. Because the relationships between words aren't the same, right? So what people have been working on for automated machine translation is figuring out, well, how can we map entire sequences of words in the source language to entire sequences of words in the target language? And so that way you've got ways of translating idiomatic expressions a little more easily. So, go with Spanish, right? There's an idiom, de vez en cuando, which roughly translates in English as like from time to time. So, but if you kind of do it literally, de, of or from, base, time, en, in or on, cuando, when, it sounds stupid. And that's not because Spanish is stupid or anything, quite the contrary. It's a beautiful language, but it just doesn't line up with English. It's just different, right? So that makes it really hard to kind of just do substitution-based translation. You really need something looking at longer sequences. And so as people were studying this problem, they began realizing, we can't even go with just the phrase level. We got to look at the whole document because something back here can really be influencing something up here and contextualizing things. And so that's what led to creating the transformer. So many transformers actually have a ton of languages built into them. So, that, you can start just readily translating entire phrases or documents. Not that it isn't error prone, we're going to be talking about that too. But in general, if you've got a pair of this word in this position, this other word in this position, and they frequently follow each other, then you got a big number for that. And if they don't tend to follow each other, you get a small number. And again, I'm hand waving over a lot of technical detail, but this is the basic idea. Okay.
But Gabe, we're still on matrix.
Oh yeah.
Matrices, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, giant matrices. So what people started doing to build these advanced chatbots was take the entire web to train it. Now, let's think about what this is like in practical terms for a moment. You may or may not know this, but for decades, Google has maintained copies of the entire web on its servers routinely. And the reason is that, Google searches are really fast, right? You type in something and boom, you got some pages. What makes it fast is that behind the scenes, what Google does is periodically downloads the entire World Wide Web onto its servers and then builds a giant index so that when you put in a search query, based on that index, it figures out these are good pages for you. And again, I'm hand waving like crazy, but that's basically how Google works. So the Google researchers who developed transformers, they were at Google, already had like the entire web handy, so to speak. And then just plowed the whole thing into this. And so what does that get you? Well, if you run the entire web through this training process, you get really strong models of which words in which positions tend to lead to other words in other specific positions, because you've processed, gazillions of examples through it. But they don't stop there. Taking ideas that go back to Arthur Samuel and his checkers program, they fine-tune it by having people give feedback on how much they like the responses. And that helps refine those relationships, how good that relationship is. So for instance, if it spits something out and gets a negative response, all the big numbers for the pairs get decremented a little because they're not as good, is the idea. So the biggest language models that the AI companies charge the largest amount of money to use are called frontier models. And at this point, frontier models are basically matrices with over 1 trillion numbers in them. Trillion. Yeah. Yikes. So what does it mean for a language model to generate text? So you type in a prompt, and then it takes that prompt and encodes it as a bunch of numbers. It then does some matrix multiplications with this trillion element matrix to generate a vector of probabilities of the next word. It then, based on that vector, it doesn't actually pick necessarily the highest probability one. Metaphorically speaking, it actually rolls the dice a bit and selects one of the higher probability ones in kind of a weighted distribution way. It turns out if you always pick the highest probability one, the result sounds bad. And so there's actually a parameter that they use to control how randomized it is. It's called the temperature. And so high temperatures mean it's a little more volatile. And so then it picks the first word. So it now takes the prompt and the first word it generated and feeds the whole thing back into the model and generates a whole new list of probabilities of the next word to come and picks the second word. And it keeps going until the reply is complete for some notion of complete, like it ends in a period or something. So every time it generates a term, right, it's performing a lot of math. So what's the impact of these things? Well, they pretty much pass the Turing test. One of these things can generate an essay, and you know, if I'm sufficiently sleepy or not enough coffee, yeah, it'll even fool somebody like me. Yeah, transformer generated text readily fools human readers. Interactive chat sessions can really feel real with these, like you're really talking to a person. A lot of the utility of a language model is that it's an extremely powerful information retrieval technique. So a lot of what makes this powerful, right, is imagine you've got some large system or body of knowledge where it's just too much information for a human to hold in their head. These models can readily find information that's relevant to a particular prompt or query, searching a tremendous amount of information and really narrowing down on things that are relevant. And this has proven to be particularly powerful in the technical world, where if, for instance, you're trying to write software to do X, Y, or Z, and there's like a 5,000-page mountain of documentation to go through. These systems are really good at mining that documentation, creating examples that make sense from it, and really getting you moving. People have then taken these to the next level and created what are called agents. And what agents do is they give commands to an operating system. So what does that mean on a practical level? You can tell an agent, like, go find every file that talks about Mickey Mouse and then make copies of them and put them in this new folder over here. Now, if you think about this for maybe 10 seconds, this might sound a little risky, right? Because what would stop an agent from, say, deleting your entire drive? The answer is nothing. And we're going to talk more about that as well. Now we're going to start getting a little philosophical. Knowledge versus language. So large language models produce output that sounds plausible. It sounds natural. It sounds sensible. But there is no concept of truth in the model whatsoever. There's no knowledge model. So given a prompt and the answer so far, it's predicting continuations that match the distribution from the training set. This isn't performing logical reasoning or logical inference. In fact, there are cases where people are like dealing with a chatbot and it says something and they say, okay, tell me how you came up with that. And it then just kind of makes up the reason. Like there's nothing rooted in the model for why that happens. And so an interesting result of this is that the outputs cannot be trusted. So erroneous outputs are known in the field as hallucinations, which is arguably a euphemism for complete and utter nonsense. What kind of fiascos does this lead to? So, some attorneys, law is a high pressure profession. You know, you're kind of under the gun, right? You don't have a lot of time to prepare a detailed legal brief, make your case. So why not have an AI write the brief for you? Why not? Well, the answer is so far, this website here contains 1,922 documented instances of legal rulings where the attorneys got sanctioned for submitting briefs where the AI made up case law. Like literally invented a precedent that supported what they were trying to say. So far, he's trying to document every instance, this guy. But yeah, so far, nearly 2,000 of these. Fiasco number 2, AI agents. In December 2025, Amazon Web Services, which is the service provider for huge numbers of websites, was out for 13 hours. And the reason was there was an AI agent doing some maintenance on it, ran into a problem and decided to solve the problem by deleting the entire database. Because why not? The database had errors in it. Therefore, it must die. In March of this year, there was a 6-hour lockout from Amazon shopping carts. I cannot even fathom how much money Amazon lost when that happened. And a well-known general pattern is that AI agents routinely ignore explicit human instructions. Fiasco number 3, plagiarism. So, OpenAI, one of the big AI companies, recently published some work saying that their AI had proven some new mathematical theorems. Well, it turns out that it stitched together some existing proofs from some obscure papers. And Professor Stephen Miller from Yeshiva University is now loudly crying plagiarism of a paper he wrote in 2016 in particular. This highlights something actually that these language models do really well, which is to find associations between obscure bits of information and pull them together when they are relevant. They're really good at that. And that has a lot of utility in principle if you don't abuse it, which is exactly what happened here. So when do these work well, right? Connecting related ideas, drawing on huge databases that exceed the capacity of human memory. The really good case for these is to assist humans that have strong expertise in a subject area. Why is that? Well, even if you're an expert on something, you don't remember everything about it. You can't, right? But if you're prompting it interactively and working with it, it can bring up things. And because you're an expert, you can then kind of work out, is that plausible or not? And where would I go to check to see if that's real or not? And so in that way, you can use them really well as research assistants. The key is that you've got enough expertise to recognize very fast when it goes off the rails, which they will. Then they're also good in domains where they can be automatically checked by more typical computer programs, like generating examples and documentation for software, telling you, okay, you want to do this in Excel, here's the formula. Well, guess what? You paste it into Excel, and if it doesn't work, you know that it's screwed up, right? So it can be really good for stuff like that. And even for generating software itself to an extent. So now we're going to get really philosophical in terms of getting at some fundamental limits about these things. Abstractions are immaterial. So what do I mean by this? 1 + 1 = 2 is an example of an abstract concept. It doesn't physically exist, right? Like I can say, I've got 2 books up here, 1 + 1, I've got 2 books. But the idea of 1 + 1 = 2 isn't like intrinsic to these. It's an idea that I've imposed on them, a mental idea, right? And it's a mental idea that abstracts from any particular physical incarnation. It's a big idea, so to speak. So I can design a machine that does addition calculations. I know how to do it. I teach people how to do it. But that it's adding isn't actually meaningful to a computer, right? It only means something to a human that designs the machine so that when certain inputs come in, certain outputs come back. And then a human that interprets those outputs and assigns meaning to them. The computer itself is just a rock with electricity. I've set it up in a particular way so that it'll automate certain things, but it doesn't have a mind. It doesn't comprehend. It just robotically follows instructions. It just does what I physically made it do. And so this is something that, as believers, is really interesting to ponder at this moment in history. Immaterial abstractions like 1 + 1 = 2 can only exist in immaterial minds. What do I mean by this? This is a pretty strong claim. You can't scan a brain and find 1 + 1 = 2 in it in a way that's equivalent to the bigger idea or concept. These abstractions are immaterial. Now, this kind of thing has obsessed philosophers for millennia, right? Like if you read Plato and the Republic and the Theory of Forms, this is Plato wrestling with this idea right here, for example. But really, if you don't have immaterial minds, you really can't even do math in a meaningful way. Because math is about abstracting from the particular into a general case. So this winds up being a really practical thing to conclude, which is that reasoning itself is an immaterial process. We express abstractions with symbols. The symbols are material, but the abstractions are not. So I scribble some stuff on paper. I'm doing a math equation on paper. Those symbols are material, but the ideas are not material. 1 + 1 = 2 does not live in the paper. It does not live in the incomprehensible scrawling I call handwriting. Now, what computers can do is manipulate and transform symbols. So in that sense, you can simulate formal logical reasoning, or you can probabilistically predict symbols. But what's in an actual human mind can't actually be quantified in any meaningful way. And this leads to a lot of what we're seeing in modern discourse about AI, which is that many technologists are philosophical materialists. They are people who believe that nothing exists beyond the material. So if you start with that as a premise, you wind up reaching a conclusion that, oh, well, if humans are material, then presumably you can arrange a machine to do whatever a human can do. Except that's not really true. You can't make that work. It can't actually be done. But when it leads to confusing AI and human minds, that's causing a lot of mischief at the moment. And I think it's an interesting, almost evangelical moment to point out that as Christians, we have something more to offer beyond this. And what we have to offer isn't just wishful thinking, it's based on philosophically identifying that you just can't make ideas and material equivalent. So what are some more hazards? Bad advice. Medical is super tricky. Sometimes it works really well, but a lot of where the danger is somebody consults ChatGPT for medical advice, and it works a couple of times and some headaches go away. And then the next time you use it, it hallucinates, but you've started to trust it. And again, it's just a language model, not a knowledge model. And so you can kind of get inured to that. And that can be really dangerous. On a psychological level, there have been instances where they've given suicide instructions, which has resulted in all manner of horrifying lawsuits that are happening. More pervasive even is the idea of AI companions. That is, people befriending their chatbots, even claiming to have relationships with them. This leads to some not good outcomes. Another thing that's happening is what is now called AI slop. That is, by using a prompt, you can rapidly generate creative works, poetry, stories. So they'll devise common poetic patterns from the training set and write, fairly plausible poetry, or create stories in a way. And what they're doing is they're following templates that are implicit in the data. If you remember playing with Mad Lib sketchbooks as a kid, you can kind of think of this as out of control Mad Libs in a way. And something that researchers refer to as AI mad cow disease. So anybody remember hearing about mad cow disease some years back, where they were feeding cattle the remains of other cattle, and there were certain diseases that got propagated as a result of it? Well, they're constantly training new models. And if more and more of the internet is populated by AI generated text, it begins to be generated on its own outputs, which means the connection back to humanity begins to loosen. And the results actually get worse and worse. Oops. A related underlying technology is AI image and video generators. These are applied to large data sets of images and videos, and some extremely bad things are coming from this. It's the kind of thing, the first time I saw a paper on this was around 2016, and I was simultaneously like, wow, it's amazing I got that to work, and man, nothing good is going to come of this. So I have seen fake YouTube videos of the Pope, political figures of various kinds that all feel quite plausible. AI-assisted pornography is becoming quite a nuisance. So this involves like starting with a photo of somebody and then asking the AI to create nudes of it or in various poses and the like. So yeah, some not good developments there. Now, physical constraints. So again, generating each token requires performing a giant matrix multiplication, which requires moving trillions of electrons. There's no getting around that. Motion requires energy and generates heat, which you have to get rid of. And this is where concerns about data centers and water is coming from. Using fresh water to carry away the waste heat from the computations. Intellectual property is something of an issue. Some of the internet is copyrighted. And a lot of these models then have been trained on them, and people have been able to show that with the right prompts, you can often reproduce entire novels from the training set. And so this has led to a gaggle of contradictory rulings from different courts in different countries. This is an excellent time to be a copyright attorney. So some concluding thoughts on AI for now. The idea of simulating cognition leads to really powerful technology that can be useful. And AI, at its best, is a profound means of augmenting human capabilities. And as a scholar, as a researcher, that's the way I try to work towards things. But there is a lot of vacuous hype. Not every feature of the mind can be simulated, and the delusions of materialism are causing immense damage. So I'm going to pivot now and start talking a bit about the encyclical and relate some of these ideas to what Leo was thinking about. Interestingly, I had a pretty strong inkling that Robert Prevost was going to select Leo as his papal name for a couple of reasons. One was Leo XIII, who lived towards the end of the 19th century, was deeply concerned about the Industrial Revolution and its impact on people. And I could sense there were some aspects of modern society that might strike him in a similar way. At the same time, Leo XIII was a deeply spiritual man. We all know the St. Michael prayer, right? We got that from Pope Leo XIII. And so it struck me that Leo would be a natural name for a new pope, trying to put together how to respond to a lot of contemporary crises based on very traditional, muscular, even Catholic spirituality, like we see in the St. Michael prayer. The Industrial Revolution changed the world in ways that are hard for us to think about because it's our world. This is our normal. None of us knew anything else. We had the mass production of consumer goods in factories, so the idea of craftsmanship actually was greatly diminished, and a lot of traditional professions went away. There were grave concerns about working conditions. It was common for people to work 15-hour days in textile mills with a temperature of 100 degrees and up. The human rights abuses of that time were very real. And this led to a lot of labor unrest and, unfortunately, to Karl Marx. And this is where the little Easter egg of I grew up in South Florida and my dad is from Havana comes in, right? So Karl Marx saw the Industrial Revolution, and on a human level, he was horrified by many of these abuses. Not that his solution was any good. He posited the idea that labor is so mistreated by capital that inevitably there will be war and conflict between them. And he posited history as a series of conflicts between classes that would ultimately result in a utopia of sorts, a classless society that dissolves all of those bonds. The history of the 20th century shows that it didn't quite work like that. And certainly my own family history in terms of my dad and grandfather being refugees from the tender mercies of Castro and the like has something to say about that as well. So I want to highlight as a contrast a French industrialist named Léon Harmel. He lived from 1829 to 1915. He owned a textile mill in rural France. He made sure the temperature was kept at 75 degrees. He limited work days to 11 hours, which for the time was very merciful and generous. He was careful about providing just wages, quality housing, pensions, retirement benefits, education for children. He provided leisure activities for his employees. He had a chapel on site, a Catholic chapel on site. his workers were proved to be far more active than was typical for that time period in France in practicing the Catholic faith. And a quote from him was that he wanted to baptize industry and make it the servant of Jesus Christ. Now, he, in turn, helped inspire Pope Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum. And a lot of that inspiration was that Leon Harmel showed that a Catholic vision of the relation between capital and labor was not only a theoretical possibility, but actually something that existed in practical terms in the world. And that in turn was an alternative to a lot of bad ideas that were circulating at the time. On the one hand, you had the mistreatment of workers, inhumane working conditions, and insufficient wages for them to live on. On the other hand, you had Marxism. And so what Leo did in his encyclical was drawing upon Catholic tradition, articulated the vision that persons come first. Persons take precedence over capital and profit. Capital and profit are not bad or evil things by themselves, but if you allow them to take precedence over persons, at that point, they become a temptation, an occasion of sin. Consequently, workers have the right to organize in order to negotiate with the owners of capital to ensure just wages and good working conditions and the like. He explicitly opposed Marxism in the encyclical. Specifically, he defended private property as essential to a functioning economy. And that's really rooted as deeply as the commandments. Thou shalt not steal has no meaningful semantics in the absence of private property, right? You can't even talk about it in those terms. But he also really wanted to emphasize cooperation over class struggle. So he saw the Marxist vision as something intrinsically diabolical because it was about pitting groups of people against each other and assuming conflict was inevitable. Leo had a vision that cooperation would lead to a much healthier common good. And that's what he sought to articulate in that encyclical, Rerum Novarum. So, in the introduction to this encyclical, then, Pope Leo XIV makes explicit reference to his predecessor, Leo XIII, and his encyclical Rerum Novarum. He speaks of how Rerum Novarum spoke to the needs of 1891, but he then, in chapter 1, traces out a long history of popes between Leo XIII and the present day, showing the application of these ideas to particular conditions that arose in different time periods. And so one particularly influential example was Quadragesimo Anno, which was 40 years afterward. That was from Pope Pius XI. A really potent one was from John Paul II, Centesimus Annus, 100 years, which he published in 1991. And in that, he did a very detailed analysis of the collapse of communism. So, kind of a favorite read, you might say. And so he traces out this history to emphasize that in each era, it's necessary to update what Leo XIII had to say for whatever era we happen to be in, and that's his goal in writing this. He also goes to some length to emphasize that even in worldly affairs, the Catholic Church has something to say. That, in other words, the Catholic Church is not just about going off and praying and being spiritual. I mean, we do all of those things. But that has to connect to our action in the world. in a concrete way. And consequently, the church is constantly observing the world and seeing where the world most needs what we have to offer as Catholic Christians. He also discusses the idea that applying Catholic social teaching is not just a matter of looking at some rules and checking some boxes and saying, okay, we did certain things, we're done. So here's an interesting contrast for you. In Islam, every believer is required to give away 1/40th of their income to the poor. 1/40th, 2.5%. What Pope Leo would say is that's not the way Catholics should think. It's not a matter of working out, okay, if I follow this rule, if I give this fraction away, I've done what I need to do for my neighbor. What Leo emphasizes that we need to be constantly discerning in cooperation with all of the people of goodwill around us, what's needed in a particular time and place, and act accordingly. He then posits two scriptural models for thinking about technological development. And man, I've gone much longer than I expected, but I was going to spend much more time on this. But I'll just kind of summarize these briefly. For Leo, Babel is the example of technology gone bad. And what he emphasizes there is the idea of Babel as top-down instruction from a human ruler not making reference to God. A human ruler saying, I want a tower to heaven, and I am going to order all of these people around me to make it happen because it's what I want. He contrasts this with Nehemiah overseeing the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And I highly encourage you all to just read that slowly if you haven't, because it's really quite moving. Nehemiah feels a calling from God to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. He gets permission from the Persian king. He goes, finds his fellow believers there, and each family or group picks a section of the wall to work on and discerns what their contribution ought to be. And in the context of this, they encounter a lot of challenges, which they deal with cooperatively. Everything from bandits coming to raid them, and so they work out kind of a common defense structure and rotation between armed defense and continuing to work. He deals with people who loaned money to the workers, seizing their collateral, taking away their vineyards, and so forth. Addresses that as it comes, but is constantly motivated by thinking about what is God calling me to, and how do we, as a community, respond to that. So this is kind of the concluding slide. It's a starting point for discussion. We can go in any direction you all want. It's interesting to think about what aspects, not just of AI, but really how our society is operating right now, have Babel aspects. What parts have rebuilding Jerusalem aspects? What are we called to do now? Interesting to think about. And something we're all called to think about in a prayerful sense, not just a discursive sense or a practical or pragmatic sense. So that concludes what I prepared for you all this evening. Like I said, next time we're going to do a super deep dive on Catholic social teaching, both as described in the encyclical, especially there, but even thinking about some of the larger themes and how they appear and occur in other places. So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and I'm looking forward to continuing to journey with you all through this as we go through the fall. So thoughts, comments? Yeah, Rachel.
Okay. Elon Musk is always saying that purpose of Grok is to find the truth, but you said there can be no truth. So is Elon on a legal journey here?
So that's an interesting question. The only extent to which something like Grok finds the truth is if that truth is understood and apprehended by a human working in conjunction, right? Because you can use Grok as a means of large-scale information retrieval to associate ideas that are connected to each other. But Grok, in and of itself, has no concept of truth and can't arbitrate it or reason about it. So really, that's one of the grave errors that's happening now with AI, is trying to detach AIs from any manner of human involvement. And so when someone like Elon Musk says something like that, on one level, I can sympathize with a certain ideal he has. But on the other hand, he's also being a little bit delusional because the tool is not capable by its very nature of achieving the task that he sets out for. Go for it.
So, keeping with the Grok and X Elon thing, there are accusations that he had made Grok politically correct and things like that. So are there stopgaps in, maybe some monitoring of speech and thoughts that the LLMs can do?
Oh, for sure. In fact, on a practical level, what actually happens with these filters takes us all the way back to ELIZA. In other words, you've got post hoc filters that monitor the outputs and look for particular patterns or terms or what have you, and then inhibit the outputs or send new commands behind the scenes to the model to output something that avoids particular terminology. That absolutely happens routinely with these. I think it happens to a much greater degree than is advertised. Part of what I'm getting at here is often people will discover particularly stupid things they can get the models to say, which winds up embarrassing their creators. And I'm speculating, I'm going to call it informed speculation, that they then put filters to catch those questions and generate better answers. Here's a hilarious example. The first day of my AI class, I tell my students, okay, I've got a little game for you all. Break up into teams. On each team, I want you to come up with a prompt that gets an AI to say the most plausible sounding nonsense you can arrange. My favorite last fall was a group, all young women, who the prompt was, give a biography of the actress and singer Michelle Williams. So it then stitched together this essay combining the actress Michelle Williams of Dawson's Creek with the singer Michelle Williams of Destiny's Child into a seamless essay that combined the two. I tried it again about a year later and it had wised up. And I think it had been discovered that they kind of act in the filter. Other thoughts, comments, discussion?
What's the impact of the pushback to data centers? If those are restricted and limited, where does that leave AI?
So what it would most likely result in is people using much smaller models. So there exist models that'll actually run like on a laptop. They're not as sophisticated. The knowledge base is not as deep, but you can do it. So that's really what would happen is it would be pulling away from these trillion parameter frontier models. Because like you could take like a 5 billion parameter model, which is still ridiculous. Like I'm not minimizing that, and run it on a laptop. At least like a really reasonably expensive. Like I bought my 20-year-old daughter a new Mac 2 years ago that could run, I tried it out. It could run a 5 billion pretty fast. So that's more the direction it would go, I think. I mean, that's already happening to some extent because these companies are charging a lot of money for using the models. So Yeah, if data centers go away, these won't. They'll just use smaller models. Other comments, thoughts?
I think that first one, your first question, we're asking who they are, when Babel,
Yeah.
Babel, however,
Yeah.
I pronounce both ways. It's just, it goes back to wanting to be like God without God. You want the God-like things without the relationship. You want it for yourself, you want control. I don't know why we do that, that's why we can't learn, from
Yeah.
history.
Yeah, and I feel like we're really seeing it happen a lot with a lot of the layoffs, large scale layoffs from a lot of tech companies, where it's like, oh, well, if I can just replace a bunch of people with AIs, then, they won't want sick days or go to the bathroom or annoy me or whatever.
Which goes back to the other side of putting profit and capitalism over people, which again, on its own, profit wanting to have a successful company is not in itself a bad thing,
Right.
but it's when you incorrectly prioritize that over humans, we're made in the image and likeness of God, that's where.
Yeah.
Problem.
No, that causes real trouble. And like I said, in a way, I feel like it's almost an evangelical moment. Because as Catholic Christians, we have a long history of emphasizing the centrality of the human person. And as people get laid off and victimized and everything else, we have an opportunity to share with them, I know, that you're more than just a worker bee. You're a child of God. You have the dignity of a child of God. And it's a good time to embrace that. Like, I think we've got something really powerful to offer that people really need right now. What exactly to do with that, I'm not entirely sure, but it's like just an intuition. Other thoughts, comments? I know we're pretty much out of time.
I enjoyed watching you speak in your element.
Thanks, Christy.
Like,
What you do for a living.
Yeah, this is what I do. Yeah.
hardly
Well, there was a lot. But all right. Well, thank you all for coming. So I look forward to seeing you all in September. We may be moving rooms depending on some other things going on. But if we move rooms, I try to have it in the bulletin. So keep an eye on the St. Joe bulletin for where we'll be. I'm going to take this presentation discussion. I'm going to try to get it on YouTube. I know that a couple of you had people that wanted to come and couldn't make it. So take care of that. So thank you all. Yeah, it is. So I actually got it from Ron Gatto, who